Hello and welcome to SEC Newgate UK's panel event titled Trade Cooperation Agreement, the Legal and Political Perspectives of Getting Brexit Done. This event is hosted by SEC Newgate's trade team with our partners from Cambre Associates and Rosenblatt, and I'm really delighted to be joined by such a great panel today to discuss Brexit and the new UK-EU deal. I'm Sabina Tilsley. I'm the Deputy Head of Trade at SEC Newgate Advocacy, and I'll be your host for this afternoon to lead us through the many questions that we have got for our panels that we want answered. Just to briefly introduce our panel, Tiffany Burrows is the Head of Trade at SEC Newgate UK, and with over 6 years of public affairs experience, she leads our advocacy practice for clients in the international trade, employment and skills sectors. She's a real industry leader, having made it into the PR Week's 30 Under 30 list and was shortlisted in 2019 as Consultant of the Year. And she's Vice Chair of the PRCA Public Affairs Board Executive Committee, leading on diversity and inclusion. So thanks so much for having joined us today. Robert Bell is a competition and regulatory partner at the corporate department of Rosenblatt, recognised as one of the London's leading lawyers by Chambers and Legal 500. He has over 30 years of experience advising clients in complex competition and regulatory matters, and he's advised clients on a range of those issues. But notably for today's event, he also advises on a range of other regulatory issues, including international trade and customs, economic sanctions, state aid, national security, and foreign investment filings. So thank you, Robert, for being here. And last but not least, Tom Parker is founder and executive chairman of Cambre Associates, an award-winning public policy and corporate affairs consultancy, which is part of SEC Newgate. And with over 20 years of experience, Tom has extensive knowledge of European public policy and the wider corporate environment. And when he doesn't wear this hat, he's also president of the British Chamber of Commerce, EU and Belgium. So thank you, Tom, for being here. Obviously delighted to have you all here. Now, before we get into the weeds, and we've got some very specific questions to cover off today, just tell me all how you're feeling about Brexit now, about 5 years from the 2016 referendum. Robert, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Sabine. Well, I think the TCA was an act of political expediency. It had to be done to fill the vacuum of a no deal Brexit. And so what we see now is the UK and EU's trade relations developing very differently to a pre-Brexit position. And it's not just the TCA as one agreement, it's a whole host of other agreements. You've got a citizen security partnership, an agreement on governance, and a whole host of other agreements. And there are provisions for further agreements to be added to that list. And so, I think that's an indication that this agreement was cobbled together quickly for obvious reasons. And, very much, it's very much a work in progress still, and there's still more to come down the track. I think a lot of the real effects of Brexit have been put on ice because of the COVID restrictions. And it's quite hard to actually see what the real effects are going to be sort of long term, because there's a lot of political grandstanding going on. So that would be my initial reaction to where we are at the moment.
So work in progress, and you've been very much kept busy over the last 5 years, I'm hearing. Indeed. Tiff, tell me how are you feeling after, 2016 is a long time ago now.
It certainly is. And actually the kind of preparation for the referendum in itself, I remember moving down to London and starting my public affairs career, and we were talking about what would happen if there was a referendum, how would it happen, what would be the potential outcomes, and that definitely was a long time ago. I think I'll probably reference my grandma at least twice in this, and apologies in advance, but she is the bellwether of public opinion in my mind. She voted for Brexit, and it was the first time she'd ever voted in her life. And to the ordinary person on the street, Brexit, there was genuinely, it was hard to work out why it was taking so long. And I think anyone on this call listening will absolutely know why it took so long, particularly Robert, obviously as a lawyer. But it was it was difficult for her to comprehend why it was taking so long. So I think in a way where we are now is very much a case of, to most people, okay, Brexit's done, but it's not, yes, it's a work in progress, but to me it's just started in terms of the impact and the detangling of certain things. It's difficult to disentangle a relationship of that size and entity in a matter of years.
Yeah, and I think the EU would have also liked it to have gone a little quicker. Tom, you're obviously giving us the Brussels perspective. So how do you feel about Brexit now 5 years on?
Pragmatic. Brexit and the UK-EU relationship is what it is. It's defined by the TCA. The TCA, frankly, is at a level of ambition which in many ways was defined by the United Kingdom, not by the EU. I think the EU would have hoped for something a little bit more ambitious, but very clearly there was a trade-off between something which brought closer integration and cooperation and the freedoms that the United Kingdom was looking for. And so we have to live with the TCA the way that it is. And very clearly what we've experienced, and here I'm speaking with my British Chamber of Commerce hat, is that it has meant real differences in these first 3 months of the year. Some of that has been masked by COVID, but already you are seeing some real change, and particular for the business community.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true, and we do kind of want to talk about that quite a lot today in the time that we have. So all of you have mentioned the TCA in some form or other already. So just diving a little bit into that, and thank you, Robert, already for kind of giving us a bit of a framework for what it is and almost what it isn't. I mean, to what extent do you think the TCA has delivered on the government's promise of barrier-free trade?
Right, you asking me?
Yes.
Right. I think, first of all, there are 4 points to note, really. I think, first of all, one of the great success stories of the TCA was that the vast majority of goods would be subject to zero tariffs and quotas. And, of course, that was heralded as really being the main part of the agreement. However, I think it's important to note that the freedom of tariffs and quotas are tied to the UK broadly keeping regulatory equivalence. And there are provisions in the agreement which allow the EU to retaliate against what's called unfair competition provisions. So any race to the bottom in terms of standards as far as data protection, employment, environment, state subsidies, standards, you name it, that would cause or could cause the EU to retaliate and take away that tariff-free sort of access. I think the second point to note is that although the tariff-free access was good news, it's quite narrow in its application. So it talks about UK origin goods, and we all know that there's some quite narrow technical customs standards in relation to what constitutes EU origin goods. So that has, we've seen clients come into difficulties with that. Secondly, I suppose the second point is we now have two separate legal and regulatory regimes where we have a series of sort of technical standards, companies being forced to reinvent different regulatory processes for the UK and for the EU, and not just in one regulatory process like we had before. So that is causing a great deal of problems. And indeed, probably the heart of it is the non-tariff barrier, which people and traders are experiencing. A large increase in the amount of forms to fill in. Certain people estimated that a 50% increase in the amount of red tape and bureaucracy. But it's not just that, it's inspections, it's a whole host of rules, measures of equivalent effect. And that is, I think, what's going to cause problems in the TCA in the years ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that, Robin. And I think we definitely, again, want to dive a little bit deeper into that in a second as well. But on some of those problems, and I think some of these teething issues in particular, obviously they are widely reported on in the media and are sometimes causing political problems. So Tiff, can you give us just a bit of an idea of what the political implications of the Brexit deal have been?
Yes, absolutely. And just following up on what Robert said quickly about the impact on businesses, the main aim of the deal, and the UK government, to credit to them, never pretended otherwise, at least initially anyway, about the fact the aim was to have zero tariffs. They did somewhat disingenuously changed it for it to be barrier-free trade. And as Robert has listed quite a few examples of that, that's just not the case, particularly on the non-tariff barriers. In terms of the political impact of the Brexit deal on the UK, there's a couple of strands I wanted to tease out. So the first one is the UK itself. So there's been huge implications for the union. You'll see, obviously, we have elections coming up in May. There's a renewed enthusiasm for the union from the UK government in terms of banging the drum for all of its benefits. Very briefly, after the deal, although it ruined quite a few of our Christmases, I'm sure, the Tory government probably got a bit of a boost from the fact that they delivered on the main objective of getting Brexit done. I would also say that, and maybe this is me being cynical, but the timing of the deal over the Christmas period probably helped as well in terms of the news cycle and how that works, and also Parliament not sitting to the extent that I think perhaps those scrutinising the deal would have liked. The only other thing I wanted to touch on, because I'm sure we'll get onto this in a much more detail later, is global Britain being untethered by the Brexit deal. But also there's another internal debate going on in terms of the culture war and the metropolitan elite. It's no longer the Leavers versus Remainers, or Believers or Ramonas, whatever you want to call them. There's a renewed focus in terms of the cultural debate about flag waving. Obviously, from a British point of view, there's lots of debate around the BBC and their role, but also that actually has political implications, because the one group of people we haven't mentioned so far is the opposition, and Labour's handling or mishandling, depending on how you see it at the moment, of both the referendum, the aftermath, and where we are now, and Labour's position on getting Brexit done and what happens next.
Thank you, Tiff. That gives us really quite a lot to talk about in the next few minutes. But you've mentioned getting Brexit done twice now. I mean,
I'm a sucker for a slogan.
quite facetiously, though. I mean, have we had Brexit done? And Tom, can I just pick up? I mean, the European Parliament has yet to ratify the TCA, which is obviously part of the process of getting Brexit done. Do you think it will? Can you tell us a bit about those perspectives?
If you'd asked me that question at the beginning of the year, I would have said yes. If you'd asked me that question a month ago, I would have said yes. If you asked me 3 weeks ago, I would have said yes. And then very possibly last week, I might have said no. Now, we've had the news that today there is, I think, a lifting of the mood. There seems to be some cooperation around vaccines. But I think it's fair to say that since the beginning of the year, the mood, not just in Brussels, but in EU capitals, has been, I think, not good, quite frankly. They feel that the UK has neither respected what it has committed to in law, particularly around the Northern Ireland Protocol, or in spirit. We've had this episode with recognition of the EU ambassador, and this has created a lot of problems. Ultimately, I think the European Parliament will ratify. There's, I think, everything to gain on all sides. But, there is a lot of politicking going on around this. I've just been reading the EPP's draft position on trade, and, there's a section on the UK relationship, and, they're very supportive, but it's conditional on, a number of things. It's conditional on respect of what's in the TCA. It's conditional on respect of the rule of law. And these are things which are going to complicate the ratification process. There's no doubt about it.
Sabina, can I just come in on that really
Of
quickly,
course.
because I think from a UK point of view as well, it's the kind of bad faith that Tom mentioned isn't just upsetting the EU, it's also upsetting the government's own party, and has done. There was a huge debate around the breaking of international law, and it was extremely difficult for the UK government to have those conversations. And also, the one thing I wanted to mention is that how the UK government sees the EU relationship is really interesting, because it's been moved, well, in theory, been moved to the Cabinet Office. The Department for International Trade, from the UK's point of view, focuses on free trade agreements and negotiations outside of the EU. And the EU now is Lord Frost, who I'm sure Tom will be familiar with from the Brussels side, was the chief negotiator, and he is now in charge of the UK's future relationship with the EU. So from that perspective, Brexit is not done. As Robert said at the very beginning, it's a work in progress. It's, in theory, it might be done, but it's not dusted.
That's great, thank you. A few of you have now talked about some of the challenges, so perhaps if we just disentangle that a little bit. And Robert, you mentioned regulatory equivalence, rules of origin, obviously having to reinvent some of the processes here. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that, just thinking about the kind of future relationship as it was promised to us, and the TCA as you now see it? What are the sort of key challenges you're faced with every day? What are the kind of questions clients are asking?
Well, I think, I think it's quite useful to actually look at the effects from a legal point of view, that we've seen the type of problems that are coming through the door, because that might give us a hint of what's further down the track. Well, I mean, putting aside the COVID and the political grandstanding effects, I think we've seen trade flows very different this year than we had last. Certain figures show that exports to the EU were down by 40% in the early part of this year, and trade with third countries, Canada, was picked up as being increasing, and we've had channel ports less busy, and we've seen the issue of Northern Ireland rearing its head, and ports in Southern Ireland like Ross-Lair are working night and day, taking cargoes to and from the European mainland to the island of Ireland, and so almost bypassing the UK. So that's certainly an effect we've seen. A practical effect, I talked about the UK origin goods issue earlier. We've seen companies who had been happily importing goods from third countries prior to Brexit, and then either re-exporting them to the European mainland or putting them into process and then exporting them, caught because of the customs rules, meaning that those are not deemed UK origin goods. So in effect, they're actually paying double customs duties, double VAT, to get those goods to their customers on the continent. And I think that is why the UK government is so keen on free ports, because it sees that a lot of the jobs and investment are actually going to the EU. And I was told by one client that when they'd explained to the government what their problem was, they were told, well, why don't you go and open a base in the EU? And that is exactly what a lot of people have done. We've seen a huge increase in the regulatory burden, as I say. We've seen imports of certain goods, shellfish and fresh foods being impounded or stopped because they're not meeting the EU's high standards, which weren't a problem prior to Brexit, but suddenly are. We've seen other issues about customs forms, lorries being turned back. So a whole host of things. And in the area of e-commerce, there's a lot of uncertainty about what the rates of when customs duties are payable by consumers, what rate of VAT is payable, and certain EU smaller companies are just refusing to trade with the UK. So there's a whole host of issues which are there and which are having an impact. And I dare say that, as the year goes on, we're going to see far more of those. And we're going to have to address those somehow, either politically, governmentally, or legally.
Thank you. Tom, if I may just ask your perspective, because I think you already mentioned with your sort of British Chamber of Commerce hat on, that obviously there are huge challenges you're seeing, but sort of what's your experience been then since 1st of January?
I mean, it actually would really echo a lot of what Robert was just saying. I mean, we're very practically seeing a lot of these issues. So customs duties has been an area which I think really caught a lot of people out. They had misunderstood that when we spoke of no tariffs, that customs duties would be covered by that, and that simply hasn't been the case. So this has had a big impact on all trade, both B2B but also B2C. A lot of consumers who were buying through the UK, suddenly I think are deterred from that. And business equally. So that's one area. The other area has most definitely been around setting up outposts in the EU, whether that be Belgium or in particular the Netherlands. We've seen a lot of requests from UK-based companies looking into the possibility of doing that, and really sort of scouting around to see what their opportunities are. Warehousing, looking for warehousing facilities and that type of thing. So you can see that there has been a fairly consistent pattern around essentially, in particular, exporting product out of the UK. And the complication of that has meant that, most organizations have taken steps to find ways around, the bureaucracy and the practical difficulty that has come about with this change. One of the things, again, a practical observation, is something as simple as identifying, freight that will be willing to transport your goods either to or back from the UK. And there is really a reluctance because, there are penalties associated with you being stuck in the UK. And so actually what we're seeing is with a number of our members that, they're struggling to find people who will even carry their goods from one market to the other. It's challenging.
Well, a lot to digest there, but that's clearly not what the government wanted or envisaged. Tiff, can you tell us a little bit about what you think the UK and EU trade agendas look like, and obviously what they're sort of hoping to achieve?
So I was just going to pick up on what Tom said, because he's absolutely right. The UK is, different businesses are struggling in certain aspects of exporting, which is why the government's, the Board of Trade that feeds into the Department for International Trade, their report a couple of weeks ago focused on boosting British exports. The stats, I'm just going to read them out. The stats were that exports support 6.5 million jobs. It's 23% of all jobs. And the value of exports in 2019 was a third of the UK's GDP. And this might be slightly behind the times, but I remember when the UK government was focused on the productivity puzzle. So that crept up again in this report. So the goods exporting businesses are a fifth more productive on average than those who don't export. That's great, and that looks fantastic. But in terms of how that works practically, for all the reasons that Robert and Tom have outlined, that's tricky. And one of the areas, I think we might touch on this, but I'll mention it now in case, is to the government's credit and the different departments, if they don't know that these issues are happening, I mean, obviously they read the papers the same as the rest of us, but in terms of individual sectors and the problems that are facing individual sectors, they need to be told. They need to be presented with solutions as well as part of it. And yes, some of it is teething problems. There's no doubt about that. But some of the problems that we've identified are going to be here for longer term. In terms of the UK's trade agenda, I think this is what I meant by Brexit is done but not dusted, in the sense that the UK government wants to focus on the rest of the world, right? We've heard, again, welcome to another slogan, but Global Britain. And we had the integrated review that was published last week that didn't mention trade in terms of a separate part, the way it did security or defence, but it was absolutely intrinsic through everything that they said. And it covers every single UK government, or the current UK government's priorities: recovery from COVID-19, sovereignty. I've never heard the word sovereignty more than I have since 2016. Obviously, the Global Britain agenda in general, foreign policy, sustainability, the jobs and skills for the future, levelling up, as we talked about. Robert mentioned free ports, but also the international trade hubs that were announced this week in, quote from International Trade Secretary Liz Truss, all four corners of the nation. And that also goes to poverty reduction, economic growth, and frankly, saving the union at this point. So trade is seen as absolutely front and centre of the UK government's plan for Global Britain. But there's also, this year is huge for the UK in terms of the global stage. We've got the presidency of the G7 in the summer. Alongside that, we have the B7, which the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry, will be hosting. We have COP26, which interestingly is being co-chaired with Italy. So all the animosity that Tom mentioned, that, as he said as well today, that it's slightly thawing, but let's hope that that's definitely in time for COP26 in November. So there's all of that going on, as well as the fact that the UK wants 80% of its trade covered by free trade agreements. So we're currently in negotiations with the US, although that took a bit of a back foot during the election, and now we finally got the US trade representative has been confirmed. So things are going to be looking to increase there. I don't think it's likely that we'll see a deal with the US this year, but to be honest, I think a lot of people have factored that in. Also, we've got a new Director General of the WTO, which the UK are very keen to engage with to also bring the whole trading framework into the 21st century. I know that Robert mentioned e-commerce, but particularly around digital services. I'm just trying to think of all the other things that we've got going on. Australia and New Zealand, current negotiations, and there's clearly a pattern of where the UK wants to go. And we've talked about this before, Spina, but it's their own pivot to Asia. It's a bit like the not quite Obama's pivot to Asia, but definitely our own version of it. And I know that lots of people say, Britain doesn't have any. We're joining. We have applied to join the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. I promised myself I would say that in one go. And we do have a tiny amount of territory, I believe, in the Asia Pacific, and that's deliberate. When it was first announced a couple of years ago, it sounded ridiculous, right? The UK has just left its closest trading partner. Why on earth are we going to join another agreement somewhere else? But actually, it's really central to UK foreign policy at the moment. But also, that's where the future. That's where the UK government sees the future of trade and bringing prosperity to the country. So it's definitely, Global Britain is definitely here to stay, I think, in terms of the government's programme.
Well, again, a lot on and a packed to-do list for the government there. Just quickly picking up on what you mentioned, a few milestones around international cooperation. I mean, again, Tom, you picked up earlier on the fact that the mood music is not fantastic. And I think, you mentioned to us before when we spoke the disagreement with Northern Ireland, tension on vaccines, recognition on the status of the EU ambassador. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the mood is like in Brussels, and just outline to what extent you think some of these initiatives for international cooperation will be successful, considering how things are going?
Well, as I said, the mood really hasn't been great. I think the one area where there has been some appetite to sort of work closely together has been around COP26. There very clearly is recognition of the common need to be working close together on this. But overall, frankly, as I said, it's been really, really difficult. And I think from the perspective of Brussels, there is, I think, a real hesitation about what it is that the UK really wants in this relationship. I think the understanding really is that the UK isn't prioritising the EU at all anymore. And there's a feeling of that in the UK's diplomacy, in its representation, and in its attitude towards Brussels and the European member states. And I was just, looking at the integrated review the other day, and it struck me how little Europe featured in that document. The pivot towards global is very, very clear. And of course, the EU will be reading into this very carefully. One of the things that often makes me smile is I think sometimes we as Brits tend to forget that most people speak English in Europe, and they very much enjoy reading our national newspapers. So they know, what's going on, and they know about a lot of the shenanigans that are happening. And sometimes I think we forget that is the case. So, I think we do need, being a pragmatist, I think we do need to find some good positive things that we can work on. COP26 is going to be key. I hope we can work more closely on, vaccines and vaccine collaboration. Frankly, all of the stuff over the past few weeks on either side has been nonsense. And it's really imperative that we do that, because the view of the business community, or the hope, was that the TCA would be a platform to build from, and to start to build in other agreements. In the past few months, the feeling has been that actually that is highly unlikely. Now, I'm still an optimist and hope that is the case. But again, if I reference the document from the EPP that I mentioned earlier on, the language is very conditional on the UK's ambition and what the UK wants. I find that rather interesting. So there is, I think, certainly some work to do if the UK wants to sort of clarify what it wants in its relationship with the EU moving forward.
Thank you. That's really great. We've got a few questions coming in, but just before we cover some of those off, and please, everyone who's on, please do keep questions coming and submit them through the chat box. But just quickly to pick up on some of the impact on business that some of you have already referenced. Robert, I'm keen to get your thoughts again, just specifically, I think, on the point that Tom just made on EU might feel a little unloved. So how has Brexit really affected the UK companies' ability to win and retain customers in the EU? Does the EU feel like they don't really want to deal with the UK anymore, or what's your feeling?
Well, just let me pick up on a couple of themes which have come out of the conversation that Tiffany and Tom raised. The one thing that sort of strikes me is that, the effects of COVID are not going to be over in June the 21st. I think what COVID has told us is that people really need to rely on things closer to home rather than further afield. And that, in 2016, going for a global agenda seemed to be rather a sensible thing to do. But I just query whether, globalization, the effect COVID will have on globalization will be more pronounced than people think. And that this idea that you can turn your back on trading with your closest neighbors and go halfway around the world and have good trade relations there as a substitute, I would just query. But from a legal point of view, I think that a lot of people need export markets and they need their contacts in Europe. They need to continue to trade. And I think what the government's job is really to do is to actually invest time and effort to try and build relationships in Europe again, and to try and try and smooth the trading relationships, particularly the customs, the inspections, all that sort of thing, all the things which cause immense friction. They're still, and And, the lead up to Brexit hasn't helped. And I think they now need to stop trying to pretend that we're a world power and we're going to conquer the world economically, and actually really try and focus a little more sensibly about, getting trade moving again. That's my feeling.
Tom, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on Robert's point about the impact of COVID and, the wisdom of trading with parts of the world that are a long way away. I mean, certainly one of the lessons that we're starting to hear coming out of the EU, and in fact, I was moderating an event with a very high-level speaker from DG Connect of the European Commission just before this event, was a real concern about vulnerabilities in key technologies and in relation to critical raw materials because of basically very long supply chains and trading with places like China. So yes, there is a huge opportunity clearly in those markets, but one also needs to tread very, very carefully. And the example that was concretely given was semiconductors and the issues that basically a lot of manufacturers in the EU have seen in the availability of microchips. And, these chips are vital, not just in, computers, but now we see them in cars, we're seeing them in electrical home appliances. And there's been such a shortage that the EU is very seriously looking at how it can deploy its funding to basically beef up production much closer to home and to manage much more carefully those very long value chains.
I mean, I think you see in the new National Security Investment Bill that's going through Parliament at the moment, you see a definite focus in trying to keep hold of the crown jewels, the essential building blocks, which would allow us to develop high technology products and not to see them sold to potentially hostile foreign actors. And so I think that is, a real obvious way where the UK is acting to try and preserve, things closer to home.
Yeah, I think those are some really valuable points. One thing I quickly wanted to check again with you, Robert, is just on, so you mentioned quite a bit on, obviously wanting to continue to work constructively with the EU. Obviously, there are some industries that are perhaps more impacted than others. And I think beforehand, we mentioned how Brexit has impacted financial services industry. And actually, you also mentioned about businesses obviously moving onto the continent in order to save themselves from being in a different jurisdiction now. We actually have one question in the chat saying whether we have seen the biggest moves of businesses already or are there more to come? Can you just share your thoughts on that?
Well, I think just talking particularly about financial services, I think that everyone knew that financial services single passporting rights were going to end with Brexit. And they knew that there was going to be a bit of a regulatory train crash coming down the track. And they weren't going to actually be able to rely on unilateral regulatory equivalence decisions coming out of Brussels for the 59 potential sectors which are covered by the financial services industry. So I think a lot have taken the most obvious way of addressing that issue by setting up subsidiaries in EU countries to take advantage of passporting rights for those new entities. And that has been done. And to address the question about has the biggest move of business happened already in financial services, I think that's true. I think it's a mixed picture in terms of other sectors of the economy. I know I've had certain clients in sort of manufacturing industries who really haven't thought about this in time, and they are still formulating how they're going to respond medium term. So there will be there will be the possibility that if Britain doesn't get its acts together and builds bridges and gets customs and customer formalities sort of minimised, that people are going to move to Europe to circumvent those problems.
Yeah, I mean, just quoting from the headlines, just talking about manufacturing industries and perhaps some of the ones that are closer to home. UK meat producers fear 20% drop in exports. Data shows collapse of UK food and drink exports post-Brexit. Tiff, can you just give me thoughts on, how you think businesses have been adapting to Brexit, and perhaps just linking to that, what opportunities do you see for businesses to engage on this at all, to influence?
I think it was really difficult for business in the run up to the TCA being agreed, because government had a big get ready for Brexit campaign, but it wasn't depending on anything. No one knew what they were getting ready for. And I think that it was extremely difficult for any sector to work out what to do as a result of that. So, as Robert said, businesses are still working out their medium-term plans. God knows how they're approaching long-term plans in terms of what may or may not change, because Tom and Robert are right as well, that the idea is to build from this. It's not that the TCA is the be-all and end-all. I think the difficulties are still around the non-tariff barriers that we talked about, and there are things that can change, and there unfortunately are things that won't change. But as I said earlier, the key thing is for businesses to be able to relay the challenges they're facing, but also if there are opportunities. So the markets I mentioned previously and the ongoing negotiations, or even within the EU, if there are opportunities that haven't necessarily been clocked or aren't on the priority list. Tom's right, the trading with the EU is not necessarily one of the UK's priorities. It's aware of it, and it absolutely knows that it needs to be continued as smoothly as possible, but it's not building on that isn't the priority of the UK government at the moment. I would recommend any business that's listening that has any of the issues that we've discussed to look to engage with the government, but also look to engage with local MPs. The committees, both in the House of Commons, but also the Lords, take a lot of time looking at individual negotiations, but also the impact across each sector. Each department of government is facing its own challenges when it comes to Brexit, and therefore the scrutiny of the actions of those departments by committees is only going to increase, I think.
Tom, you already mentioned earlier the TCA and how businesses perhaps were hoping to be able to actually influence the specific deal or build on it. So aside from some of the tactics Tiff has just mentioned about trying to influence, can you give me your take on where you think or the scope you think businesses really have to influence and change and improve the TCA as it exists now?
Gosh, that's a good question. Quite honestly, I think, the ability to, improve the TCA in many respects is subject to how closely the UK wants to get in terms of its partnership and integration with the EU, and what sort of trade-offs it will be ready and willing to make. If it's not, and it wants to, stay firmly outside the circle of or the sphere of EU cooperation and the conditions that come with that, then I don't see that there's much scope at all for the TCA to be, in the short term at least, improved. I mean, you can tinker around at the edges. We've got other sort of agreements that are expected or provided for already. We've got the data adequacy decision, which is fundamentally important, a protocol on financial services, and equivalents there that we're looking at. But beyond that, it's going to be very, very tricky. One thing that I think we also need to keep in mind is, quite frankly, on the EU side, there's a huge amount of Brexit fatigue. While Brexit is, top of agenda in some respects in the UK, many Europeans are sick and tired of it. They just want to move on. They've got bigger issues that they want to deal with. And we mustn't lose sight of that. The relationship with the UK is one of many, many, many that the EU has. And yes, historically, we've been close partners, and hopefully in the future we will continue to be. But, right now, the EU is much more focused, obviously, on dealing with the COVID pandemic, but also some of the other strategic issues that it has on its agenda, like, climate neutrality by 2050, like digital transformation, like, the trade agreements that it has, across the world. And it does make me smile to a certain extent that the UK, positions itself as global Britain, but has effectively walked away from all of these trade agreements that were provided through its membership of the EU. Is quite intriguing in lots of ways, but I'll leave it at there for now.
Well, you're not quite released yet, because you did obviously mention the EU-UK relationship going forward already. So if I may segue into the next question I had for you, what do you think the relationship is going to be going forward if you get your crystal ball out?
I think, we are destined to face a bumpy time for the coming months and possibly years. But I think quite naturally, our geographic proximity, our history, our common interests will mean that at some point in time, I believe that there will be an ambition to come back closer together. How that looks, nobody can say at this point in time. And one also needs to keep in mind that the EU project is a project which is evolving all the time and has its own pressures to deal with. So, what Europe looks like, what the EU looks like in 2050 could well be very, very different. And I sincerely hope that, the UK is a big part of a prosperous Europe with, its partners that are currently EU members, but also other countries, that are part of a wider European project that all, I believe, have a common interest in working closely together.
Great, thank you. Please do, Tiff, yeah.
I was just going to add, Tom's absolutely right, because from the UK point of view, it entirely depends on who's in power at the time. And frankly, as Robert mentioned, COVID-19 has had a huge impact on how we do everything, including how we govern, how we engage in negotiations. So I think how the UK-EU relationship will look is honestly dependent on what year you're asking and who's in government at the time. But I think Tom's absolutely right. There will have to be, just for ease of continuing to trade, and particularly as both the EU and the UK recovers from COVID-19 and the impact that's had on European economies.
Well, I mean, just picking up on that, I agree with both Tom and Tiffany. I think there has to be an accommodation sooner or later, and the main political actors are playing roles. The EU doesn't want to let member states go outside the EU and have an easy time. The UK wants to keep on banging on about sovereignty and being a global player, but that sort of rhetoric will burn itself out eventually. And when real problems and people's livelihoods and people's jobs and investments become forefront, then there will have to be political and legal solutions, and I'm confident we'll find it. It's just that all those problems haven't quite hit yet, and they will hit within the next year or so.
Yeah, if I may just probe a little bit more, Robert, and then I actually want to ask you guys another question from our chat box. But do you see any other specific issues coming down the track? Again, in a previous discussion, we talked about competition law, merger regulation, some of which may have changed through Brexit. Not sure if you wanted to elaborate on how that's changed and perhaps any other challenges you see coming down the track.
I mean, yes, this is getting down to a more granular sort of level. We've talked about the high politics, the real effects on the street about doing business and about how competition between undertakings is regulated, how those undertakings can merge with each other has been affected by Brexit. In terms of substantive sort of analysis, not much has changed because both UK regulators and EU regulators look at the issues in very much the same way, same theories of harm, same economic analysis. But what has changed is the fact that the jurisdictions have become separate. So you now don't have an integrated merger or integrated competition policy between the UK and the EU. You have completely separate jurisdictions. And so, if there is a competition issue which affects both the EU and the UK, you can see there will be parallel investigations, both and also with mergers. Different jurisdiction mergers have to be, if they're relevant mergers, have to be cleared in the UK and cleared in Europe concurrently. So you are going to have a huge burden on management time, huge regulatory burden, which will get in the way of doing business. There's no doubt about it. And one of the problems coming down the track is, if you do have two separate competition regimes, are you going to get contradictory decisions from Brussels and from the UK? And how do you resolve those? We've had some examples pre-Brexit where national regulators were involved in a particular merger over sort of cross-channel ferries, where the French authorities cleared a merger and the UK authorities blocked it. So we're probably going to see a lot more of those tensions coming down the track.
Well, I guess we can have a whole... Sorry, go on, Tiff.
Sorry, Savina. No, really quickly, I was just going to say that the challenges politically are if anything happens to the Union in terms of, say, United Kingdom, because the arguments that were relayed and replayed, I should say, between Leavers and Remainers when it comes to the EU won't be as strong when it comes if Scotland, the Scottish government is able to achieve another referendum. It's going to be extremely difficult for the UK government or whoever is leading the charge for the Union to say, well, the economic point of view is, don't cut your nose off to spite your face. Well, that's just not going to work. And I think that will pose a real challenge to businesses having gone through Brexit continuing to go through Brexit. As Robert said, it's going to be extremely difficult to handle the uncertainty, both from COVID-19, Brexit, but a potential referendum in Scotland, not to mention the kind of murmurings of other referendums. So.
Well, the only thing I was going to say is that we've opened up some of the questions that are probably worth us having a whole event about. So at some point we'll invite you guys back. But we've gone a little over time, but people clearly seem to still have questions. So I'm just going to put a few to you and just tell me who you think would like to answer this one. So I've got one on COP26 and the point at which we can come together. Is there a focus on environmental impacts of the trade barriers we've experienced these first 3 months? An example being spoiled food. Anyone keen to take that one?
I would just sorry, go on, Tom.
No, go, Tiff.
No, sorry, I was just going to say, I think from a political point of view, again, it's going to be extremely difficult from the UK side on net zero and talking about the standards and maintaining a high level of standards when it comes to environmental issues as well as welfare, particularly, obviously, we've talked about live animals. It's going to be extremely difficult not to address this and the impact that this has. The delays and border blocks is going to be, again, one of those dichotomies where you have to address one and in order to credibly claim the other.
Tom, anything to add?
No, I was just going to say in relation to the specific point on environmental impact of trade barriers, I think, unfortunately, no. This is collateral damage which comes about because those trade barriers are in place or we have that new trading arrangement. And unfortunately, it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. Let's not forget that the UK has delayed the introduction of customs controls on its side for 6 months. So, at the moment we're seeing, goods coming out of the UK having great difficulty getting into the EU market. There is the very distinct possibility that goods coming from the EU into the UK, that also becomes very much more difficult once the UK starts to introduce its customs measures. And so, that whole area and the collateral damage, for example, on spoiled food and other, sort of issues related to that, I fear is going to get worse before it gets better.
Well, I'm hoping we're going to get a bit more of an uplifting answer from you, Robert, on the following question, which I think the person is asking on opportunities appearing from diverging legislation. The person here is saying, I was starting from the thought of the precautionary principle. Have you got thoughts on that, Robert?
Well, certainly the opportunities are there, but they're limited opportunities. Let's remind ourselves that the principle of equivalence, which underpins the TCA, means that the UK can improve certain bits of its legislation, but it can't fundamentally lower standards in certain key areas. One area which really is ripe for improvement is public procurement, which is an important area because it underpins value for money for central and local government procuring services from independent suppliers, and this area has been in a bit of a EU straitjacket for many years, and now post Brexit, that is an area where the EU can pursue an independent policy subject to certain boundaries, which it still has to adhere to. So there's going to be opportunity there. Less opportunity to do a fundamental review of data protection law, which I think the government was threatening. I think that's the sort of area, having got its declaration of equivalence or draft declaration of equivalence, it should remain happy with and not seek to undermine that, because I think that is a fundamental issue, the free movement of data about between the community and the UK about underpinning free trade. So that's fundamental. There may be opportunities to in competition policy to diverge. There is the vertical agreements block exemption, which helps companies comply with the law in terms of their distribution and vertical agreements, exclusive supply agreements. That's up for review in 2022. So, the UK has already started consultations on that. So there may be an opportunity to be a bit more liberal about how we think, competition law should be applied there compared to the EU. But those are just three selected areas. So there are some opportunities, but it's not a free for all. It's not a sort of low standard offshore jurisdiction, I would say, that sometimes the UK would like to paint. It's the more radical people in the UK would like to paint.
Tom.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on the question, and very specifically, perhaps on the precautionary principle point. The precautionary principle is something that's enshrined in the EU treaties. It's something which is really, a statement of political intent as much as anything. And I think very possibly, where there is an opportunity for the UK is for it to capitalized on very much evidence-based policy rather than policy which is, politically driven and where there's a huge amount of subjectivity. With that, I think, legal certainty business needs legal certainty, and you know, I guess for me this is one of the great pities around, you know, the whole Northern Ireland Protocol and the mixed message that sends. I think it's really fundamental that the UK continues to be seen as somewhere where, you know, the rule of law is respected. And it's an imperative that business partners around the world understand that, because if not, it creates great doubt around investment decisions and otherwise. So legal certainty and evidence base. But I think the other area where there is an opportunity is for the UK to be nimble. I mean, you know, I think the EU is like a big ocean tanker, and we've seen with vaccines it takes a long time to maneuver, whereas the UK very possibly can be a lot faster in relation to new technologies, in terms of shifts in markets. And so, you know, I would encourage it to think in that way, and take advantage of its ability to regulate quickly. So rather than a bonfire of regulation, you know, I think it needs to look at where it can set standards in such a way that actually it caters to future needs of business. And, you know, one of the things that I would hope to see, and maybe I've missed it, and if I have, my apologies, I would love to see the UK's industrial or, you know, business plan. It's not clear to me where the UK is going in terms of its economic pathway. But I think it would be a great message to the business community across wider Europe, within the UK, but I also think globally, to have a good sense of what it is that the UK is intending to do in terms of its path forward around regulation. And, you know, just coming back to the point on the precautionary principle, you know, if it was clear that, you know, there was more of an evidence-based approach, perhaps, you know, something that was, you know, with that looking more at risk rather than hazard, I think there would be a whole host of industries that would look at that and see that as an advantageous regulatory climate that would support investment in the UK.
Thank you so much. And that's really fascinating. I do really think we probably need another event like this, because we still have questions. But I think sadly that's all we have time for today. Obviously, I want to thank all of you for attending and listening in, submitting your questions, and hope you can join for some of our future events. If you have any questions that you haven't had answered, please do send them by email to trade@secnewgate.co.uk, and we can put them to our panelists afterwards. Also, if you want to receive our newsletter and invitations, you can email hello@secnewgate.co.uk and be invited to future panels such as this. And of course, I want to thank our panel so much for this fantastic discussion. It's been really great. We obviously can't hear the audience, but imagine rousing applause. Thank you so much. Wishing all of you a good rest of your evening, and goodbye.